Hi everybody, my name is Margaret,
Hi, I'm Sally.
and today we are going to be talking about scientific illustration in 20th century Mexico and the legacy that created it, specifically how Hispanic Enlightenment ideals shaped it.
Okay, first, just a little bit of a roadmap for today. We are first going to talk about a little bit of a background of the scientific expeditions in the 18th century. Second, the difference in botanical print styles. And then we have two modern case studies, the first being Elvia Esparza and the second being Margaret Mee.
Okay, so firstly, we need to recap a little bit on scientific expeditions in the 18th century and their significance. So, most importantly, scientific expeditions in Europe had many purposes, and several were completed all throughout Europe. These were included but not limited to map making, charting oceans, botanical, astronomical, and political. In specific regards to botanical expeditions, there were three main roles played. There was the artist, the naturalist, and the botanist. These expeditions were foundationally about knowledge, and specifically art and scientific expeditions were a culmination of knowledge, exploitation, and objectification. So what I want you all to think about through the course of this presentation, specifically in regards to the case studies, are the themes of seeing, owning, and knowing, and how these three topics are seen in 18th century Hispanic Enlightenment and these 20th century case studies.
Okay, so the most traditional style of these botanical prints was this European convention, and the most common paint style for this was watercolor. Oftentimes we would see a compression of time in these paintings, whether that be the inclusion of the seed, the blossom of the flower, and the flower with the stem and the leaf. It was every life cycle of the plant within a single frame. We also saw a compression of space. This picture is a really good example of that, and how the artist manipulated the plant to fold its leaf so that it fit within the frame of the painting. Another example of this, like we saw in class, was kind of the bit off piece of the leaf to still kind of withhold that or hold that naturalistic property while also fitting it within the frame of the painting. And going off of that as well, many of the artists wanted to have this, quote, naturalistic verisimilitude, which basically meant as accurate as possible so that the botanist back in Spain or New Spain could best understand the foreign plants. And in contrast to this, we see this mutis expedition style, which includes tempera paint and these really vibrant colors. Often a very symmetrical painting, both on the x-axis and on the y-axis. You can see that here, both equal sides of the plant. And this sense of flatness, not much, very little to no shading, very little three-dimensionality. And a common thread between both of these styles is this decontextualization of the plant, which basically means it's taken out of nature and placed upon this white background. Okay, and our first case study is Elvia Esparza. She was born in 1944. She was born in Mexico City. She will even state to herself that she was directly influenced by members of royal expeditions from the late 18th century. Neither of these were from the Mutis expedition. She is now currently head of the Scientific Illustration Laboratory at the UNAM Institute of Biology, and in many of her articles she states that she values accuracy of her flora and her fauna overall.
So we're going to look at four specific works of hers that sort of demonstrate divergence and similarities between Hispanic Enlightenment ideals. So the first thing we can see in both of these is symmetry, which is very common for the Mutis expedition development. That's a very popular style that we don't see in European conventions. We do see the decontextualization, which just tends to be a common theme in all these botanist artworks that again, we see beginning in the Hispanic Enlightenment and Expedition era. Something that's also really interesting to point out is we see a lack of the compression of space with the tails of these fish being cut off. Instead of incorporating some of those European convention ideals, like maybe having it bitten off or all fit in there, it actually goes against that by having that removed. It's very, very flat, which we see as a common convention of the Métis expedition, which is quite interesting. It, again, is not three-dimensional. It is a very, very lifelike and accurate photo while remaining very flat and two-dimensional to the page. So these next works of art are a little bit different in terms of symmetry-wise. While it's very balanced, they don't necessarily show us the same types of symmetry that we see in those previous ones. However, what really sticks out to me here, especially in this one of, I think, is what a lemur. It's extremely, extremely flat and almost looks like a completely two-dimensional drawing. It's quite impressive, actually, how she was able to use these compression of space and time in a very flat and non-dynamic manner. So we also see in this one too, for what it is, it's a little bit less flat and a little bit more 3D. However, it still does keep to those ideas of creating something new and like a flat, balanced, decontextualized painting. So that brings us to our second case study, which is Margaret Mee. Margaret Mee was actually born in England in 1909, and at a young age, she was a very, very actively engaged in politics, political activist, sorry. She spent her time fighting for the rights of the underprivileged and was specifically very, very against fascism. So that sort of connects back to our earlier themes of the owning part. We see the exact opposite of someone who is seeking to travel in the means of exploiting something. So she travels to Brazil at age 42, and at age 47 she explored the Amazon and studied and drew plants and flowers for over 30 years. And she was almost enlightened, but she was able to discover new ones, and they were named after her, which is just quite interesting because it shows that she was quite literally leading an independent expedition as a botanical artist. She also left behind a very well-known legacy, which has set the stage for present-day botanical artists. She has a foundation, several awards that modern artists are currently receiving, which is just quite interesting to see that kind of legacy, which is another theme that we're looking at.
Okay, so these first two paintings reflect works of her earlier career. We see this, like the Métis expedition, these very vibrant colors. Similar to the European convention, we see this compression of time in this second painting. You can see the seeds here, the blossoming of the flower, and then the final stage of the flower. So you can see the complete life cycle of this plant in this one single frame. We do not see the compression of space, however. She purposely fades these stems out into the bottom of the painting to kind of allude to the fact that they do continue and that this plant does not exist within this single frame. And then again, we see this decontextualization of both paintings. Both are placed on a very white background. And they are also both very symmetrical and have a very balanced composition, which reflects the Métis expedition stylistic choice as well. And these next two paintings are obviously very, very different than the others, as you can see of their complete contextualization of the plant. Again, we still see this very vibrant, lifelike colors that are very eye-catching. And we do see a balanced composition. However, it is not completely symmetrical, which is kind of how it would be in nature. These two pictures are a reflection of her growth towards appreciation and love for nature. As Margaret said, as she spent more and more time in the Amazon, she started to empathize with nature and recognize the deforestation of the Amazon habitat. So because of this, she wanted to use her platform to advocate for the saving of this forest. So she hoped that by contextualizing these paintings, she would reflect the codependence of the plant and its environment and the nature and the forest as a whole.
So that brings us to our final points of how we see a legacy. Specifically, we'll start with, do we see the legacy of the Hispanic Enlightenment in the work of Elvia Esparza and Margaret Mee? So yes, we do see Hispanic Enlightenment in these two artists' work and their appreciation of nature and science. We see these two factors in the seeing and the knowing. However, we also see a stylistic pattern in these works, which suggests that that these Enlightenment expeditions left a legacy both historically and stylistically, because it is still a common practice to go out into the Amazon, as Margaret Mee did, and lead a botanical expedition. So that shows us how historically and stylistically there are parallels. However, we see a divorce from this Hispanic Enlightenment by keeping their art separate from that of a political agenda, which we know that Spain used the Hispanic Enlightenment very much to further their politics and power, while modern botanical artists do not try to do this. They're more so very much interested in the science and beauty of it.
Right. So going off of that, we do see these Enlightenment goals reflected in these works of arts. However, we do not see this politicization of the plants and the Bourbon goals. And as far as she said herself, quote, "A scientific illustrator is one who translates the needs of biologists into images for an informative purpose." So this is really that seeing and that knowing of the original goals of the Spanish crown, which was to bring back knowledge to New Spain and Spain for these botanists and for these scientists and naturalists for their own scientific and medicinal purposes. And this is still the case for today with these artists. They want to create these as accurate and lifelike as possible prints for their audience and for the viewer.
So then again, we can sort of conclude with this concept of seeing, knowing, and owning, and whether or not we see these in these two artists and modern botanist art. So we do see the concept of seeing, knowing very much, and that obviously reflects on the Enlightenment ideals that have kept up in today's time. However, we do not see this owning aspect from the case studies, because these two artists are great representations of a divergence from these concepts of 18th century scientific exploration, while again leaving intact these Enlightenment ideals. As Sallie talked about earlier, Margaret Mee's works are a great direct reflection of this. For her main purpose, specifically in her divergence away from decontextualization, is the sole purpose of conservation, not exploitation. So there's an obvious absence of modern botanist art to be the purpose of exploitation.
Okay, so then to answer our final question, just to wrap it up, we see seeing and knowing in these final prints. However, we do not see owning, and we see Enlightenment goals reflected, but not the Bourbon goals of politicization in these modern prints.
So that leaves me with you all kind of a broader question of thematics is, in terms of seeing, owning, and knowing, do you all see a broader theme of exoticism, science, and knowledge? And how would you compare them from 18th century expedition art and the case studies that we showed you all today? So just think about that for a little bit, and thank you very much.
Thank you.